Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in Politics on Trial, I'm talking about two trials, though they both concern one man, the Irish politician Charles Stuart Parnell, the leading Irish politician of the late 19th century. Neither of these trials was a criminal trial. One was an investigation into crime. The other was a divorce case. In both of them, though not literally, in fact, Parnell was in the dock. And in the end, between them, these two trials changed the course of British and Irish history. The two trials that I'm talking about today are very, very different kinds of occasions. For a start, the investigation, what was known as the Parnell Commission, that sat in 1888 and 1889, lasted for more than a year. It ended up producing 35 volumes of evidence. The court sat for 6 months, and it was a legal proceedings. There were witnesses, there were lawyers, and a judgment was passed. The second trial, the divorce trial, lasted 2 days. It was widely reported in the newspapers. Most people treated it almost as farce, certainly as melodrama. Completely different kind of legal proceedings. One instituted by the government, the other instituted by a husband who accused Parnell of adultery. Such different occasions, and yet the same man involved in both. The Parnell Commission investigated many things, but one of the questions it was asking is whether Parnell was complicit in Irish Republican violence, whether he was connected to Irish terrorism. The second was asking whether he was complicit, involved in the breakdown of a marriage, whether he was an adulterer. And these two legal proceedings came to two diametrically opposed answers to these questions. In the first case, was Parnell complicit in violence? The answer was no. In the second case, was Parnell complicit in adultery? The answer was yes. And in the conventional telling of the story of Charles Parnell and Irish politics and British politics in this period, it goes that the first trial exonerated him and left him in a position to make history, and the second trial destroyed him. Was he complicit? No, cleared him, but then yes, in the divorce case, destroyed him. That is part of the story, but it's not quite as simple as that. Though completely different kinds of occasions, these two sets of legal proceedings were connected, and it's impossible to tell the story of what happened to Parnell and British politics in this period without talking about both of these trials. Parnell really was one of the dominant politicians of the age, in an age of dominant politicians, of Disraeli and Gladstone and others. Parnell was up there, and at various points it looked like he held the fate of not just one nation, but two nations in his hands. He was often thought of as a particular type of politician, and certainly for some of his critics, that type would be characterized as a traitor to his class. He was the kind of man, the kind of politician who betrayed the people among whom he was brought up and the things that he was brought up to. So Parnell came from a family of Protestant landowners. He was a landlord. He was a member, essentially, of the Anglo-Irish establishment. And he ended up leading a movement that was committed to taking on, and in some cases, to the destruction of these things. So as a landlord, he ended up leading what was known as the anti-landlordism movement, the movement of the landless, the dispossessed in Ireland, the poor, the tenants, the smaller farmers, against these big landed estates controlled by families whose ties were to Britain and whose religion was not always, but usually Protestant. And in leading the cause of anti-landlordism, Parnell also put himself at the head of, not all, but many Irish Catholics against the Anglo-Irish Protestant establishment. It made him look like a kind of traitor, but he was not a traitor to his class. he wouldn't make sense as a politician if the thought was he was like one of those wealthy young men who becomes a Marxist revolutionary. The point of Parnell was that he had a foot in both camps. At any given moment, no one could be quite sure exactly how far he was willing to go in taking the case against the kind of people he had been born to and grown up among. But also, no one was quite sure how far he was willing to go in distancing himself from the radical fringes of the movements that he led. That's what made him so powerful, so useful as a politician. If he had a type, he was the politician against type. It was really hard to know who he was. No one ever could be completely sure that they did know him. And when he appeared in a particular guise in the politics of this period, for instance, as the radical leader of the anti-establishment Irish nationalist movement, it still wasn't completely clear that he had thrown in his lot with these people, and he might be doing this in order to strengthen his position with their opponents. Likewise, when, later on, he was working with their opponents, it wasn't completely clear to anyone that he had actually abandoned his radical Republican earlier positions. And in the heated, febrile parliamentary and extra-parliamentary politics of this period in Britain, having that kind of political personality was almost essential for people not to know exactly who you were. And no one knew exactly who Parnell was. The central question for Parnell and for people trying to work out who Parnell was wasn't so much what is his true personality, what is his core set of beliefs, who is he most closely allied to, Protestant, Catholic, landed, landless. It was a more basic question, the basic question of Irish politics in this period, and it became the central question of British politics in this period. Parnell stood for Irish self-government. That could mean lots of different things to different people. At the most radical end of the spectrum, it meant independence for Ireland, breaking free completely from Britain and the British Empire. And the most radical of the Republicans were independence campaigners. At the other end of the spectrum, it could mean merely moderate forms of devolution or reform, empowering certain institutions in Ireland, giving, for instance, more power to local councils in Ireland, which was often an idea suggested by Conservative politicians in this period. But in the middle, the central idea was what came to be called Home Rule, self-government as a parliament for Ireland, a parliament in Dublin, probably under the auspices of what was called the Imperial Parliament or the Westminster Parliament, a parliament that ran the empire. Ireland would remain part of the empire, but it would rule itself in the sense that it would have its own lawmaking capabilities, its own tax-raising capabilities, its own economic functions. It would be a heavily devolved state. The question, though, for people who believed in Home Rule was how to achieve it. There were many, many questions about what Home Rule would involve or entail, all sorts of things that would have to be worked out, including one of the most difficult ones, question that's arisen in relation to Scottish devolution. Now Scotland has a parliament. What would be the role of Irish MPs sitting in the Westminster Parliament if Ireland also had its own parliament? Lots of questions like that would have to be worked out, but before those questions could be worked out, a more basic question had to be answered, which is how was this going to be achieved? And there was a choice. I think everybody understood there was a choice, and there was a radical difference of opinion as to which of these two methods would be more effective. One way of doing this was constitutionally, that is, to do it through the politics of the Westminster system. Ireland elected a large number of MPs to the House of Commons, more than 80 in this period. They could work in the Commons to try and persuade a British government to enact Home Rule legislation. It could be done by lobbying, by argument, by elections. Get more and more people elected who were elected on a platform of Home Rule. Try and work on the two main parties in Britain, the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, to try and persuade them that their chances of forming a government would be greatly enhanced if they could also embrace Home Rule for Ireland. That was one route. The other route was violence, what was called physical force, what we might now call terrorism, but not limited to terrorism, also limited to strikes and boycotts. The term boycott comes from this period. Protests, withdrawal of labour, refusal to pay rent strikes, trying to force the landlords and their representatives in the British Parliament to the table by making them squeal. But it did also extend to acts of violence, real violence, including assassination. And the question for Parnell and politicians like Parnell, who believed in Home Rule, who believed in greater self-government for Ireland, was which side of that divide to ally themselves with. Parnell, in the early part of his career, didn't ally himself with the men of violence, the hillside men, as they were sometimes called, the Fenians, a movement called the Irish Republican Brotherhood that was known to embrace violence. But he certainly got to know them. He became associated with them. In the late 1870s, just after he'd been elected an MP, he travelled extensively, getting to know the various strands of the movement for Irish self-government. He travelled in France. He travelled in the United States. The movement was widely dispersed, and then, as through much of the 20th century, indeed into the 21st century, a lot of the most radical Irish Republican opinion was to be found in the United States. That's where the guns were. That's where a lot of the money was. And that's where quite a lot of the most militant anger was, anti-British sentiment in America. And Parnell went to America and he met the leaders of that strand of Irish politics, expatriate Irish politics, the men who were supplying the men of violence in Ireland with what they needed. Parnell went on a lecture tour, a respectable lecture tour, but it was known that he had also met with many of those men. And when he came back in 1880 and through into 1881, he put himself at the head of the radical strand in Irish politics that was going to take the fight to the landlords, to the Anglo-Irish establishment, to the Westminster government, refusing to pay rents and rejecting a new piece of legislation that had been passed as a compromise, the so-called Land Act, which was there to try and negotiate a kind of compromise between the landed gentry in Ireland and the dispossessed, respecting the rights of both, including the rights of the landlords. Parnell rejected the Land Act, and that act of rejection was thought at the time to be sufficiently radical that though he was an MP, a member of the Westminster Parliament, he was jailed and he was held in prison for more than a year from 1881 to 1882 as a threat, essentially, to the British state. In May 1882, after extensive negotiations, conducted in part by a man called William O'Shea, who's going to reappear in this story, Parnell and the British Prime Minister, William Gladstone, struck a deal. And the deal was that Parnell would temper or moderate his radicalism, including his anti-Land Act radicalism. He would become one of the compromisers. And in return, Gladstone would start to work towards meeting the demands of Irish Home Rule. However it happened, Gladstone and Parnell worked out that they needed each other. Gladstone needed, among other things, Parnell's votes. 80-plus MPs in the Westminster Parliament could be the difference between one government and another government, the government living to fight another day or falling. Gladstone also needed the fact that no one could be completely sure about Parnell if he was going to bring the Liberal Party round to Home Rule. And it's not at all clear what the sequence of thinking in Gladstone's mind was on this. Did he convince himself that Home Rule was a just cause, that the Irish deserved their own parliament, that they were a people capable of self-government, and then he worked out the politics? Or did he work out that it was in his political interest to move towards Home Rule, that it would be a way of cementing his version of liberalism in power. And then he persuaded himself of the justice of the cause. Whichever way it happened, he did persuade himself of the justice of the cause, to the point that in later meetings between Parnell and Gladstone wanted to talk about Irish history. Gladstone wanted to have a conversation about all the injustices that had been inflicted on the people of Ireland by the people of England. And Parnell wasn't interested. He thought Gladstone had gone too far down that route. He had sort of drunk too heavily of Gaelic, self-indulgent, mystical history. Parnell emerged as the hard-nosed politician. However Gladstone got there, and he realised that for Home Rule to succeed, he needed Parnell, because he needed what some people called at that time the whiff of cordite or dynamite that clung around Parnell, the thought that he, Gladstone, could persuade his party to embrace Home Rule by showing that Home Rule brought men like Parnell in from the outside, into the tent, the establishment, and that Parnell was a respectable politician. But if he wasn't brought in, he and the men around him, the men that he knew, were capable of taking the fight to the British state in a far more destructive way. At one point, Parnell said, in the early 1880s, they put me in jail because I was leading agitation in Ireland. Later in the 1880s, they wanted me to stir up agitation in Ireland so that they could say, if we don't give these people Home Rule, look what will happen next. Parnell's trying to put this down, but Parnell can't control it. The only way we can let Parnell control it is essentially meeting him on the ground of Home Rule. And Parnell needed Gladstone because Parnell had come to a clear understanding that if he wanted to be Prime Minister of Ireland, which is probably what he did want to be, this could only be achieved through a constitutional settlement. And if Gladstone was offering him the means, then Parnell was willing to sign up to the deal. And that deal played out through the 1880s. In 1886, Gladstone tried to pass Home Rule legislation. Parnell had withdrawn the support of him and his party in Parliament, the Irish Parliamentary Party. Parnell's skills included being a brilliant parliamentary manager. When his troops moved, they moved en masse. They were very loyal to their chief, Charles Parnell. He supported a Gladstone government, a minority government, on the understanding that together they would pass Home Rule. They failed. Narrowly, the Home Rule Bill was defeated. And the consequence was that the Liberal Party split. There were a number of leading, ambitious, youngish Liberal politicians who could not stomach the deal that Gladstone had done with Parnell. They did not trust Parnell an inch. They thought they knew who he was, and he was not a man with whom to make a constitutional arrangement. These politicians included Joseph Chamberlain, one of the other dominant figures of the age, and Chamberlain, with some colleagues, created a Liberal Unionist Party that ended up siding with and then effectively becoming a part of the Conservative Party. So the deal that Gladstone and Parnell struck split liberalism in Britain. But neither of them thought in 1886 this was the end of the road. They had been rebuffed, but there were many, many other attempts that they could make. There were more elections to be fought. There were more deals to be done. There was more pressure that could be applied, including applied on a Conservative Liberal Unionist government. Gladstone was an old man by this point, but he had not given up on Irish Home Rule, and nor, for sure, had Parnell. They were going to fight another day. And then, in 1887, Parnell's troubles began. He had made some very, very powerful enemies, ineffectively splitting the Liberal Party. There were many Liberals who were not willing to forgive him, including Joseph Chamberlain. And though it's not clear how it happened and who was complicit in this is an era of widespread complicity in almost everything. In a sense, if the question is who's involved, everybody's involved. The real question is, can you prove it? Much harder to prove it. Not clear who was involved, but in March and April of 1887, the Times of London newspaper published 2 letters ostensibly written by Charles Parnell about an event that had taken place 5 years earlier. When Parnell was released from jail on the 2nd of May, 1882, The Chief Secretary to Ireland resigned in disgust, and his replacement, a man called Cavendish, came out to Dublin to resume that role, effectively running the Anglo-Irish administration in Ireland. The permanent Under-Secretary in Ireland, a man who survived this transition, who didn't step down in 1882, was a man called Burke. Cavendish and Burke, 4 days after Parnell was released, were walking in Phoenix Park in Dublin, and they were attacked by 2 Irish Republicans, and they were stabbed to death. It was said afterwards that they weren't planning to kill Cavendish. It wasn't completely clear that the men who undertook the attack knew who Cavendish was, because he'd only just arrived in Dublin. They were after Burke, the permanent Under-Secretary. He was their target. That was the assassination. Cavendish witnessed the attack and may have been killed as a witness. But the result was the Chief Secretary and the permanent Under-Secretary were both murdered by Fenians. Men were convicted and hanged for that crime. No one believed that Parnell was behind it. Parnell would have had to be out of his mind 4 days after he was released from jail to sanction the assassination of the 2 leading representatives of the British state in Ireland. But there was a question that always clung to Parnell, whether he knew about it or had heard about it, heard rumour of it, whisper of it. While he was in jail, he was definitely still in contact with the kind of men who would have been behind this attack. And in 1887, these 2 letters seem to suggest that Parnell had known of it, and more importantly, had approved of it. One of the letters included the phrase that Burke got his just deserts when he was knifed to death in Phoenix Park. And that letter was written to a leading Fenian, a leading member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. If these letters were genuine, they were the end for Parnell. It would be clear that he was not responsible for, but complicit in political assassination, and not just any old political assassination, the 2 leading representatives of British rule in Ireland. One of Parnell's many strengths as a politician is that he was incredibly cool under fire. He was much admired in an age where being cool under fire was thought to be a great attribute, for his insouciance, for his ability to look unfazed in the most challenging, testing political circumstances. He appeared regularly in the Commons after these letters were published, and he behaved like a man who had absolutely nothing to worry about. He dismissed them as forgeries. He clearly didn't write them. In one of them, there were spelling mistakes. Parnell let people know that he knew how to spell. Why would he have written these letters? It was obvious that his enemies were out to destroy him. He refused to be cowed. And he demanded a commission of investigation to inquire whether he did have links with the violent wing of Irish politics. And so such a commission was established. It was called the Parnell Commission, so it had his name on it. It wasn't just about him. Its brief was expanded to include the question more broadly of whether he or his party, the Irish Parliamentary Party as it was called, and any of its leading members, had clear links to a range of people and events who were effectively, in the eyes of the British state, terrorists. The commission sat in 1888 and 1889. At the heart of the commission was the question of the letters. There were many, many witnesses called, but 2 witnesses counted. First was a man called Richard Pigott. Rumours circulated that Richard Pigott, an Irish journalist and a man with a known vendetta against Parnell, was the forger of the letters. And Pigott was summoned to appear before the commission. He was questioned by, among others, Parnell's lawyers, over a few days. And in a way that rarely happens in any legal proceedings, he completely incriminated himself in the dock. He effectively broke down and confessed. He wasn't just a terrible witness, he was a completely self-destructive witness, to the point that it almost became farcical. And there are accounts in this very formal Victorian official government legal proceedings with distinguished lawyers on all sides and senior politicians and judges in attendance, that during Pigot's testimony, the court broke down in laughter. People couldn't quite believe how easily he gave the game up. And he did give the game up. Among other things, he was caught on the fact that he admitted he couldn't spell one of the words that was misspelt in one of the letters. Many, many people were involved in these proceedings, and in this age in which everybody knew everyone and everybody reappears always in a different guise, no one is quite who they seem. Among the people involved in the Parnell Commission were the young lawyer, very little known or heard of in this period, who was the junior counsel on Parnell's side, representing Parnell and his party, the Irish Parliamentary Party, who was thought to have had a good few months, a good set of proceedings, including the destruction of Richard Pigot as a witness. His name was Herbert Asquith, H. Asquith. He was going to go on and be Prime Minister. One of the people who had helped identify Pigot before the proceedings even began made it clear that Pigot needed to be called, had done his own forensic investigation of the letters, and was convinced that they were forgeries and that Parnell had nothing to do with them, was a notorious figure of the age called Henry Labouchere, a radical liberal politician, a journalist, a rumour monger, in many ways a deeply disreputable man. But he was on Parnell's side, and he helped get Parnell off. Labouchere is also known as the man who drafted the amendment that was attached to a completely unrelated piece of legislation, which insisted that the Sodomy Act, which made sodomy a crime and had made sodomy in an earlier age a capital offence in Britain, needed to be amended to include other acts of indecency between adult men. This was the legislation that would be used to prosecute and convict the other most famous Irishman of the age. Not long afterwards, in the next decade, Oscar Wilde would be brought down by the Labouchere Amendment, but Labouchere helped exonerate Charles Parnell. After Pigot broke down, he was a broken man, and this was a period where it was almost part of respectable opinion that if you'd been humiliated in such a way, particularly in a court of law, if you could no longer even conceivably pass as a gentleman because you'd been exposed not just as a liar and a forger, but as a figure of fun, Pigot was treated by these grand men in this courtroom by the end of his testimony as a figure of fun. The right thing to do is to commit suicide. 2 weeks after he gave evidence in the Parnell Commission, Pigot committed suicide. He shot himself in Madrid. The other person who was a central witness in those legal proceedings was Parnell himself. And Parnell gave a very distinctive kind of performance in that of his various personae, he just adopted one for these proceedings. He claimed to have almost no knowledge of violent Irish republicanism. It was nothing to do with him. He was the respectable, mainstream, Westminster-based friend of the Prime Minister of Gladstone, the former Prime Minister, Charles Parnell, the man in whom the British establishment had put their trust in trying to negotiate a settlement for the intractable Irish question. He was, as always, insouciant, calm under fire, relaxed in the dock, almost too relaxed. One or two people noted that he didn't seem to be taking it quite as seriously as maybe he should, a little bit mocking of these proceedings, but completely clear that what was being investigated, violent Irish republicanism, really had nothing to do with him. There was always a respectable explanation for why he'd been in the United States giving a lecture tour, why he had travelled to this place or met these people. It was all part of the respectable Charles Parnell, the man the establishment trusts. And it worked to the extent that when the Parnell Commission reported its findings in 1889, the final report was published in November 1889, Parnell was completely exonerated of having anything to do with the letters. The letters were determined to be forgeries. A series of charges against Parnell and his colleagues that they had known about, been involved in, had helped organise acts of terrorism were dismissed. But he wasn't completely exonerated. The Commission also made clear that there was a connection, there had long been a connection, between Parnell's brand of politics and this brand of violent republicanism. They were not as disconnected as Parnell had suggested in his own testimony. Nothing in the Commission report suggested that Parnell was lying, but plenty in the Commission report suggested that the Parnell who appeared in those proceedings was not the whole story. At the same time, Parnell had done some damage to his reputation with the hard men of Fenianism, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, whom he'd effectively disowned under oath. He had said, I don't know these people. They knew he knew them. He knew they knew he knew them. They had seen the performance too. They could put it down to politics and politicking. But at the same time, Parnell was no longer quite to be relied on in whatever ways he'd been relied on before by the men he had disowned. He came out of the Parnell Commission exonerated, cleared, and at the same time compromised with both of his core constituencies. He was compromised with respectable British opinion because this report said he was not completely detached from Irish violence, and he was compromised with the men of violence because he had disowned them in a court of law. All of Parnell's career was a high-wire act. The politician against type, the man you can never be sure who he really is always vulnerable, sometimes, to being on the wrong side with both of the sets of people he's trying to persuade he's one of theirs. Nonetheless, the result of the Parnell Commission was that at the start of 1890, Charles Parnell looked like he was the hero of the hour. When he appeared back in the House of Commons after his exoneration, he was greeted as a returning, conquering hero. His hold over his party in Parliament, over that party in Ireland and in the country, was as strong as it had ever been. And through 1890, Parnell looked like he still held the keys to the kingdom in his hands. But at the same time, the people in the know, and that would have included all of his parliamentary colleagues and a significant section of public opinion, were also aware that he was facing a challenge. Because at the end of 1889, at the time of his exoneration, a man called William O'Shea, the same man who had negotiated Parnell's release from jail in 1882, the go-between between Gladstone and Parnell, an Irish politician of some significance in his own right, but by the end of the 1880s, as Parnell's star continued to glow, O'Shea's career was effectively finished. He had worked closely with Parnell earlier in his career, but by that point, they were effectively politically estranged. That man, William O'Shea, sued his wife for divorce. And it was known by everyone in the establishment that Parnell was the other party. Catherine O'Shea, Kitty O'Shea, the wife of William O'Shea, had for many, many years been Parnell's mistress. They had effectively, at various points, lived together. O'Shea knew about it. He was completely complicit in it. The political class knew about it. The divorce proceedings were launched at the end of 1889, but they only reached court in November 1890. So through 1890, this thing was hanging over Parnell. He knew what was coming, a divorce case in which he would be named as the adulterous party. But he seemed completely unfazed by it. As awareness of the case grew, his leadership of the Irish Parliamentary Party was put to the test, and it was ringingly re-endorsed. He told people there was nothing to worry about. He would emerge from it untainted. And they believed him. He was incredibly persuasive. He seemed like a man who had nothing to worry about. And yet it was known that the facts of the case were as they would be reported in the divorce proceedings. He was the lover of Mrs. O'Shea. More than that, 3 of the children who'd been born to Kitty O'Shea during her marriage to William O'Shea were Parnell's. One had died, but two were still living. And this was known too. Parnell had a family with this woman, and yet he was apparently convinced that his reputation would be, if not untouched by this, effectively untainted by it. Why did he believe that? I think it was partly because he thought everybody knew. Everybody, in a way, was complicit. O'Shea was complicit. He and O'Shea had clearly had an understanding for many, many years that he was O'Shea's wife's lover. Politicians knew it. Many of them had far darker secrets in their own lives. And earlier politicians had undergone a similar arrangement. For instance, a prime minister, Palmerston, before he became prime minister, had married a woman who was the sister of another prime minister, Melbourne, and the wife of a leading aristocrat, and his mistress. And when she was widowed and he married her, he was known to be particularly affectionate to some of his stepchildren, because it was also known that they were his children. He had fathered children by this woman when she was married to someone else. He had then married her, and he'd gone on to become prime minister. And something about that sense that in British politics, you could get away with this stuff seemed to cling to Parnell in the face of the fact that this story was different. She was not widowed. This was divorce proceedings, and in divorce proceedings, evidence will be given. The reason that O'Shea sued for divorce at the end of 1889, and hadn't done it earlier when he and Parnell had started to fall out, was because he had been waiting for his wife to inherit a significant sum of money from an elderly aunt. It's like something from a novel. So much of this story reads like something from a novel. Mrs. O'Shea, Kitty O'Shea, had an aunt who I think was entering her 90s by this point, who had let it be known that she was going to leave a large sum of money to her favoured niece. If O'Shea was still married to Kitty, that money would be his, because we were still talking about a period in Britain in which the property of a wife belonged to her husband. So to divorce Kitty O'Shea would mean that William O'Shea lost the bequest. The aunt died, and it turned out that she had left a large sum of money to Kitty, but left it in trust so that her husband couldn't get his hands on it. And at that point, O'Shea launched divorce proceedings. This for him was about money. O'Shea was a pretty terrible man, or at least he was a pretty terrible husband. No evidence was presented in the divorce proceedings from Kitty O'Shea, but long afterwards, various affidavits were discovered that she'd sworn as part of these proceedings, describing her husband's terrible infidelities, his abuse of her and their children, his spendthrift ways. She could easily have divorced him if she wanted to, though there would have been much scandal. He divorced her clearly in the hope that she and Parnell would pay him off, and he let it be known that the sum required was £20,000, a huge sum of money then, but not beyond all bounds of possibility. £20,000 conceivably could have been raised by Parnell to buy off O'Shea, but he couldn't lay his hands on that sum of money. But the other problem for Parnell is that he seems genuinely to have loved Kitty O'Shea and to have wanted to marry her. And the only way he could marry her, and indeed legitimate the two children who were living, who were his, was for her to be divorced. He allowed the divorce proceedings to go ahead, partly, it seems, because he wanted to marry Kitty O'Shea, and partly, it seems, because he believed it would be clear to the people who counted that this wasn't some great moral outrage. This was a story of a kind they would recognize from the past, the present, and the future, in which men like him, and there are many men like him, and men like O'Shea have a kind of arrangement which in the end breaks down and needs to be rearranged. And this would be the rearrangement. He couldn't let it be known that he and O'Shea had an arrangement in which effectively they shared O'Shea's wife, because under divorce law, collusion on the part of the husband in the adultery means adultery cannot be grounds for divorce. So were the divorce to be able to go through, Parnell couldn't say O'Shea was part of this all along. He had to defend his and his wife's position, and he concluded that the way to do that was simply to allow the case to proceed. When it was over, to marry her, to legitimate the children, and to carry on. The case did proceed. It lasted for 2 days. Evidence was given by servants and others of the O'Shea household that Mrs. O'Shea and Mr. Parnell had committed adultery in that house. Servants were clear that they had been together in rooms and overnight and for extended periods of time in which adulterous activity had taken place. More than that, they gave evidence that Parnell often escaped the house when O'Shea was coming, and he sometimes did it by climbing out of windows and up and down drain pipes. This really was farce, this set of legal proceedings. It was like a West End farce. Pulling his trousers on, jumping out the window and skedaddling down the drain pipe. It was undignified. It was ridiculous. It also looked like a man trying to hide his adultery. That was not what he was doing, in the sense that he was not hiding anything from O'Shea, but they were keeping up appearances. Everybody had agreed that they would keep up appearances. And he was also keeping up appearances for the sake of the aunt. He was as keen as William O'Shea was that Kitty O'Shea should inherit that money. So there really was an element of farce to this, not West End farce, but farce in the sense that it was just ridiculous what they were doing. They were trying to present a respectable front on an arrangement that everybody involved knew was not respectable. Money was involved, adultery was involved, collusion was involved. Nobody was the innocent party. The divorce was granted. Neither Parnell nor Kitty O'Shea gave any evidence in the proceedings. They were not represented in court. All that was heard was O'Shea's petition and the evidence of adultery. It partly made Parnell a laughingstock, but it also outraged respectable opinion, public opinion, that didn't know the ins and outs of this story, didn't know that it was all one giant charade. They just knew that Charles Parnell, one of the leading politicians of the age, had been named and proven in a court of law to be an adulterer. And in particular, religious opinion turned against him. But in the conventional telling, it's assumed, usually, that the opinion that turned against him was Irish Catholic opinion, that Parnell could no longer be the representative of Ireland's Catholics because the Catholic Church in Ireland couldn't tolerate the idea of a known adulterer as its political representative. That's not what happened, or at least it's not what happened first. The first group of people to turn on Parnell were English dissenting Protestants, the heirs of the Puritan tradition, and Gladstone's base, the people who were absolutely central to Gladstone's electoral coalition. And they were outraged that the Liberal Party would be doing deals with a known adulterer. And they made it clear, English Protestant dissenting opinion, not Anglican, but dissenting opinion, where the real Puritanism was, that they would not tolerate Gladstone continuing to have dealings with this man. It's not clear what Gladstone thought and what calculations he might have made, but it was made clear to him that he had to break with Parnell, so he did break with Parnell. He let it be known he no longer believed that Parnell could be the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party. The news that Gladstone believed this arrived just after the party, after an incredibly fraught and contentious meeting, had allowed Parnell to remain as leader, and Parnell did remain as leader. But his position was fatally weakened because his party was split. What happened was not a rejection of Parnell, but the split, first in Westminster and then in Ireland, of the movement for Home Rule. But Parnell would not give up. He refused to accept that a divorce case could destroy him. He went on and married Kitty O'Shea, and he carried on, in his own mind at least, as the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party committed to creating a parliament for Ireland. He fought through 1890, a series of by-elections, against his opponents in that party and outside that party. He was repudiated by the Catholic Church, that is, the leaders of the Catholic Church. But many Catholics stuck with Parnell, and many of his parliamentary colleagues stuck with Parnell. It was a genuine split. And through 1890, Parnell revealed himself. He realised he could no longer play the double game. The double game was done. He couldn't be the man for all seasons. He had to make clear what it was that he stood for. And so a politician who, throughout his political career, had always been slightly ambivalent about what for him was the bottom line, made it clear what for him was the bottom line. And he established, through 1890, after his fall, after he became an object of ridicule, after he was hissed at and booed and attacked in public. At public meetings, he had lime thrown in his eyes that nearly blinded him. He got letters and shouts out from crowds telling him that the correct course for him to take was the one that Pigott had taken. He was expected to commit suicide by many people, genuinely expected that this is what he would do. He was also sick in 1890, increasingly sick. He looked like a really haunted figure. And yet, through 1890, he campaigned, he fought, he refused to give up his leadership of his party. He tried to hold his party together in the name of something that he had never completely articulated before. What it turned out in 1890 that he stood for was not the rural, disadvantaged, landless Catholic peasantry. It was not the Catholic Church. It was the cities of Ireland, not the countryside. It was Dublin, above all. It was the workers of Ireland. He didn't reinvent himself, but established himself as a politician who wanted to lead Ireland to material economic progress. He wasn't interested in that Gaelic mysticism. Gladstone was right when he saw that Parnell didn't want to go down the road of talking about Irish history books with him. Parnell was interested in progress. He wanted to stand for not just the workers, but the unions, the labour unions of Ireland. And he wanted Ireland to be prosperous and united. And that meant, among other things, he wanted it to include Ulster and Belfast. He went to Belfast in 1890 and gave a speech in which he said how much he admired the people of Ulster and the people of Belfast, the Unionists, the ones whose connection was to the British state, how much he admired them for what they had built in Ulster and Belfast, because that was the prosperous part of Ireland. That's where the industry was, the shipbuilding was. That's where the workers were better off. He wanted to raise Ireland to the level of Belfast, which meant that a united Ireland would have to include within it at least some accommodation with the people of Ulster who were not Catholics, who were Protestants, and who were not nationalists, were unionists. Some kind of Irish compromise would be needed in order to give Ireland its destiny as Parnell had come to see it, had come to articulate it. The destiny of a united country that could basically join the modern world. That was the vision for which he stood in 1890. Clearly, he gave the clearest speeches of his career. Many people thought in this period of what was happening in Ireland in terms of the French Revolution. And Parnell said, Dublin is to Ireland as Paris was to France. Paris, the centre of the revolution. Not the peasants, not the countryside, not where there is lingering attachment to the church, not where the church dominates, not effectively where the counter-revolution might start, the reactionary conservative version of Irish independence or Irish self-government, but the vanguard, the workers, the urban dwellers, the cities, where the industry is, where the connection is with the wider world, where there will be trade, where there will be commerce, and where there will be progress. He was effectively a Jacobin in this period, and it was too late. He articulated his vision only once his downfall was already unstoppable. He articulated his vision only when he was finished. Reading about Parnell, and particularly reading about those two trials, Pigott and the forgeries, the divorce case, the climbing in and out of windows, the farcical element, the absurd amount of melodrama in these proceedings. It's like reading a novel by Anthony Trollope. Trollope's novels about high politics of this period are very close to the story of Charles Parnell. The two greatest of those novels Phineas Finn and Phineas Redux, about an Irish politician who comes to Westminster and either is or isn't corrupted by Westminster life and high society, has many foreshadowings of the Parnell proceedings. And it's thought by some people that Phineas Finn was based not on Charles Parnell, but on William O'Shea, his nemesis. And in the descriptions of Parnell's downfall, the last year of his life, the melodrama is again almost absurd. In her account of the last months of Parnell's life, Kitty O'Shea wrote that he did contemplate suicide. And at one point they were walking on the seafront together, and he turned to her and he said, I quote, oh my wife, I believe I will jump with you and we shall be free forever. And she replied, as a good Victorian wife, as you will, my love, but the children. Even Trollope, who had a taste for melodrama, probably would have shied away from quite so melodramatic an exchange. And yet, Parnell was magnificent in the last year of his life. He was astonishingly courageous. There was nothing farcical about some of what he said and some of what he did. His willingness to face down his enemies, to stand, finally, for what he believed in, to marry the woman he loved. In the divorce proceedings, almost incredibly, his and Kitty's 2 children were put into the custody of William O'Shea as the wronged husband. But when they married, they were able to reclaim their own children and legitimize them. He did all this in the last year of his life when he probably knew that he was dying. He was sicker and sicker, and he was still a young man. He was only 45 when he died. Almost everyone in Victorian politics in this period, maybe almost everyone in this kind of high politics, is playing a double game like Charles Parnell was playing throughout his political career. Gladstone, Disraeli, none of these people were straightforward. None of them were ever sincerely themselves. They all had different faces for different audiences. They were all willing to act against type when it was required, and they knew that the ability to act against type was almost the magic source of high politics and the ability to hold on to power in a time when politics was both rarefied and ritualized and full of ceremony and just beneath the surface, violent. The violence of Irish republicanism in this period was real for all of the people involved. But this is also the high point of the British Empire. This is a time where the stakes were extraordinarily high. A lot of this was matters of life and death. And yet the language, the refinement of the high politics was very, very neat and nuanced and nimble. And the ability to be Gladstone, to be Disraeli, to be Parnell, was to be able both to channel the raw politics and to dilute it in forms of politics that meant it was possible to move from one side to another, to be 2 things at once. And yet probably to survive in that kind of politics, to be Gladstone, to be Disraeli, to be Chamberlain, there had to be a core, there had to be something that people sensed was the essence of who you were, something that made you a whole person. And with Parnell, that was never quite clear. It's not probably the case that if he hadn't been part of those divorce proceedings, if he had found that £20,000 and bought off William O'Shea, or if William O'Shea had dropped dead a year before the divorce started, and he'd been able to marry not the adulterous Kitty O'Shea, but the widow Kitty O'Shea, and go down the Palmerston route back into respectability, it is probably not true that he could have then, with Gladstone or someone else, fulfilled the dream of Irish Home Rule, because Irish Home Rule was very, very complicated, and no one had ever worked out the parliamentary arithmetic, not Gladstone and not anyone who followed him. And it's not clear Parnell had worked it out too, but it's also the case that it wasn't just the divorce case that did for Parnell. It was the Parnell Commission as well. He was compromised by that commission. He had alienated respectable opinion in London by his association with the hard men, and he had alienated the hard men by his association with respectable opinion in London. He could walk that tightrope, but only for so long. And at some point, he was going to have to decide which side of the line he was on. And when he made that decision, the project might have collapsed. Who knew? But it's not the case that there wasn't a core to Parnell, that there wasn't something that he believed in, that he could articulate as the essence of his politics. He did articulate it in 1890. If there's a tragedy to the story of Parnell, tragedy along with the farce, and there is a lot of farce and melodrama, the tragedy is, in this case, one can genuinely say, he only articulated it when it was too late. A quick reminder that if you'd like to join us at our autumn season of screenings and live recordings of this podcast with the Regent Street Cinema in London, films of ideas, followed by discussions with really interesting guests. All the details are on our website, ppfideas.com, the films, the guests, and how to get tickets. We're taking a short pause in Politics on Trial for the first episode in a new occasional strand that we are calling Now and Then with Robert Saunders, our regular PPF guest and contributor. In this strand, Robert and I are going to be talking about anniversaries and what they mean for politics today. We're going to start with the anniversary in 1955 of the lowest unemployment rate ever recorded in British political history. What happened to the idea of full employment, and what is the politics of unemployment in 2025? Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.